Hello, friends and fellow crafters, and welcome back to Inktoberfest, October 2022 by Maker Forte. I'm your designer for today. My name is Deepa Robbins, and for day 23, this video is all about resist techniques. Now, you might be familiar with a bunch of different resist techniques. I have two that I want to share with you that you probably know about already, and then a couple more that you might not be too familiar with, and I'm hoping you can learn something new. So let's go ahead and start with the first card. And for this one, we're going to do just basic emboss resist. So you're going to need a stamp set and some embossing powder. And we're going to be using Maker Forte Crystal Clear Embossing Powder, along with the Wildflower Bouquet stamp set. So for this technique, the first thing that you're going to want to do is create an ink blended panel. Pick any colors that you like, any inks that you like. I'm using Distress inks right here, and I'm going to be using three colors: picked raspberry, blueprint sketch, and wilted violet. And I'm just going to carefully blend the colors together to create a blended panel from one color to the next. I'm starting off with the picked raspberry, and I'm just adding it on there with my blending tool. Then I'm going to add on the wilted violet, and then what I do to make sure that my blends are very nice and kind of cohesive from one color to the next is to go back with the first color over the join between the two. So I'm going to take the picked raspberry and go back over that line between the wilted violet and picked raspberry. Then I'll do the exact same thing for the blueprint sketch. I'll add that on to the other end, and I'll go over the join between the wilted violet and the chipped sapphire with the wilted violet again. I find that this is the key to making perfect blends and making your panel look flawless. Now for this technique, I really do recommend using vibrant colors for your panel, because what we're going to end up doing is using darker colors on top, and our embossing is going to let these beautiful vibrant colors show through. Now, before you go on to the next step, it's important that you do dry your panel. Allow it to dry completely, because you're going to be doing embossing and you don't want to have any stray powder. So another tip for that is to use your anti-static powder bag. I'm using that in excess just to make sure that my panel is completely dry. Now, at this point, you can basically place your stamps however you want on your panel. You can create a background, you can create a focal point, whatever works for the card you're making. For me, I'm just going to create a focal point, and I'm going to use two of these wildflower bouquets to do that. I've got the larger bouquet that I have a little bit further up towards the top in the center, and then I'm going to add another one overlapping just slightly near the bottom to create a big bouquet just in the center of this panel. So I'm going to stamp both of these with embossing ink, and once that's done, I'll go ahead and add my embossing powder. Now this is crystal clear. I'm using the clear because I want the color from this panel to show through. So now that I've got the embossing powder on there, I'm just going to use my heat tool to melt it all. And you see, once it melts, you basically it becomes invisible. You can see a bit of it on the purple portion of the card, but once it's done, you will see it shining, so you know exactly where your stamped image is. Now, the next thing, and this is the fun part, is to add a darker ink on top. So this, I think, is the fun thing about inks and why I love Inktoberfest, and, playing with the inks that you've got and learning more about them. So you can see I'm using Distress inks. These are dye-based inks, so you're going to get a very vibrant color, and that's what I really wanted for this. And it's going to soak into your panel. Your panel is porous. It's soaking in that Villainous potion and the Uncharted Mariner that I'm placing all around this card. I've focused the Uncharted Mariner in the center and the Villainous potion around the edges just for a bit of an effect. But you could use any color as long as it's darker than your original panel, or the emboss resist is not going to show as vibrantly as this. And now, once you've added all that ink, it's important to kind of just buff off your embossing. And you can see the embossing, because it is glossy and not porous, it resists the ink. And that effect, I think, is absolutely amazing. Now, just to kind of bump this up a little, I am using a bit of water, and I'm just flicking it onto my panel, and I'm going to dry it off with that dry towel just to create a bit of I guess, more of like a fairy type whimsical look. And now to finish off this panel, I'm just stamping out a sentiment from the same Wildflower Bouquet stamp set. And I've stamped it out with that embossing ink, and I'm adding some Maker Forte Solar Flare embossing powder, which is absolutely amazing. It is a gold embossing powder that has a glitter accent to it, and it looks stunning once it's melted onto the paper. So I melted that embossing powder and I cut down that sentiment strip, and now I'm just adding it to my panel with some foam squares. I'll attach it to an A2 sized black card base, and that's my final card for this technique. So we can all agree that everyone probably knows this technique. So let's move on to something just a little bit different. This one is called layered ink emboss resist, and we're just going to layer inks on top of embossing to create a resist effect with different colors. And in this case, instead of using distress inks, which are dye based, which you probably learned earlier on in the month, we're going to be using oxide inks, which have a pigment aspect to them. So they look a little bit different. And that's why I wanted to show you this technique as well, because I wanted to show you two cards with dye or distress inks and oxide inks to show the difference with emboss resist. Now you can see I've got an A2 sized white card panel again, and I'm using now the Gingko stamp set by Maker Forte. I've kind of just placed the stamp wherever I want. This is totally up to you. You can place your stamps however you want it on your card panel. And I'm just adding some more crystal clear embossing powder. I've heated that up, melted it, and now I'm taking some Salvaged Patina Oxide ink, and I'm literally just taking the ink pad and placing it on the panel. Now this is also why I used oxide inks. My oxide ink pads are very full of ink, and it's much easier to ink up your panel this way than ink blending. It just takes a bit longer to do that. So now you can see that I used my heat tool and I made sure that this panel was completely dry before moving on to the next step, which is to stamp out the Gingko stamp another way. So I've lined it up in my MISTI, and now I'm adding a lot of anti-static powder, because that anti-static powder is going to catch any dampness on the panel if I did miss drying it completely. So again, I've gone ahead and added my embossing ink, and I've stamped out the Gingko pattern in just a different area of the panel. I'm adding my embossing powder, the crystal clear, and I again will melt it. Now this time the embossing powder is trapping that salvaged patina underneath it. And I'm going to take my next color, which in this case is shaded lilac, and again I'm going to add this all over my panel. So this is why I use the oxide inks. I can actually build the colors on top of each other without too much mixing going on. When you use dye inks for this technique, the colors are just going to completely mix one on top of the other, so you have to use your lightest color on the bottom. And I'm trying to do that here too, but you'll see with my next step that's kind of gonna get lost, but we still get a beautiful effect with this, with mixing our inks as well. Okay, so I've buffed off the excess ink from that embossing, and now again I've dried the panel completely. I'm adding my extra anti-static powder, and I'm stamping out the other half of this panel with the Gingko stamp. Again, I'm going to be heat embossing it with the crystal clear embossing powder. And now we're trapping the shaded lilac mixed with the salvaged patina underneath that embossing that we just did. So for my final step, I'm going to add some saltwater taffy. Now this color is a little bit lighter than the shaded lilac, so you can imagine it's not going to show up as much. However, again, because this is an oxide ink, it's going to sit on top of the last layer a little bit. There will be a little bit of mixing, because keep in mind, likes dissolves likes, and these are the same type of inks, but you will see more of the saltwater taffy than you would if you were to be using dye inks. So again, I've buffed off the excess ink there, and this is the beautiful panel you end up with. So now all we have to do is make this into a card, and to do that I'm actually using these Maker Forte toner sheets. Now this is the Vintage Christmas Greetings edition here, and you can see you have all of these beautiful Christmas sentiments. Now I know this card doesn't look 100% Christmassy, but I thought the nice soft colors would work nice for this. So I'm actually cutting out that Merry Christmas sentiment there, and I'm going to end up foiling that. Keep in mind there are coordinating dies you can get with that set. I just don't happen to have them, so I thought cutting them out would work fine. I'm using some Mer-mazing Maker Forte Deco foil here. And this is a nice grayish, shiny color with hints of like aqua in the background. So I've got my laminator all set up here. It's been heating up for a good 10 minutes, and I have it set on 3 mil. Now you can see I've got it in this pink paper carrier, and you can see I'm putting it in the wrong way. It doesn't go in the bottom, it goes in the top. So I'll place it through this top and then just let the heat, the heat from the laminator heat it up and move it through and allow the foil to attach to the toner. And I don't just put it through once. I like to rotate it 90 degrees and then put it through a second time. And this is just basically a double check just to make sure that that foil is really adhering to the toner. I've had issues with laminating with the laminator in the past, so there are various other ways you can laminate. You could also use a foiling machine with a solid plate, and that always gives perfect results as well. So once I pull it out, I like to kind of press it down a bit and just kind of make sure that everything's attached and the foil's adhered. And then I'll just pull everything off. And sometimes you get a bit of overfoiling, and it's not really overfoiling, it's just that the foil hasn't fully come off of the areas that aren't supposed to be foiled. So I just kind of rub it with my finger, and those tend to come off nice and easily. So once I've got that all nice and foiled, I'm actually going to go ahead and stamp out another Gingko image. So I've kind of picked one of them. I'm kind of selectively stamping it on this white piece of cardstock, and I'm using embossing ink again, and I'm gonna emboss this with the Solar Flare embossing powder, which, as I said, is gorgeous. And once I've got that all heated up there, I'm actually gonna fussy cut out that Gingko, and then I can use it as a bit of a focal point on this card. So let's put this card together. I'm going to attach the panel to an A2 size top folding white card base. And then all I have to do is add that Merry Christmas sentiment. And I'm going to do that with some foam squares. And then off a bit to the left, I'm going to add that little Gingko that we just heat embossed there. So I actually put this entire card together and I kind of looked at it and I thought, you know, maybe I need to add just a little something extra. So I actually went ahead and cut out a couple strips of gold glitter cardstock, and I'm just going to add them on the left and the top edge just to kind of finish this card off. And you can see that even though I used, the Oxide inks, the colors did kind of mix together, and it's always fun working with inks like this because you never know what you're going to get in the end. So I would have expected that those Oxide inks would have sat on the top of each other a little bit more and not mixed as much, but it turns out they mixed a lot and created more of a purple background, which actually works really well with this. And I think it turned out pretty nice. Maybe next time I'll use lighter colors, and that way the Saltwater Taffy will show a little bit more. So now let's move on to a technique which you might not be familiar with, and we're going to do alcohol ink resist. Now, in order to do this, we're going to use watercolor paper along with some alcohol inks. I've got Stream, Clover, and Shell Pink. And you're also going to want your blending tool with the felt pads for alcohol ink, blending solution, and I'm using watercolor paper here because it is porous. So we're using alcohol ink, which would normally be used on Yupo paper, which is slick. In this case, we're using the porous paper because we want the emboss resist effect. We want the alcohol ink to resist the embossing and be soaked into our paper. So just like all of the other panels that we've done today, I am heat embossing this panel. Now it's important to make sure you add enough pressure with your stamp tool because this is watercolor paper, which has a bit more texture to it. So you want to make sure you're getting it in all the little nooks and crannies of that paper. And then once you've stamped it all out and you've heat embossed your entire panel with the crystal clear embossing powder, now we can go ahead and start working with the alcohol inks. So I've got my felt tip blending tools and I'm using Shell Pink to begin with. So I'm just adding the ink right onto that felt pad and I'm just going to smush it basically or glide it across the watercolor paper. And you can see that it's just soaking up that alcohol ink, and this is what you want to occur. Now I'm also adding some clover to this felt pad and I'm going to add some stream as well. I wanted the variation in the green colors and I did want to have it mix with the pink. But as I did this, I realized the pink was just getting covered. So in the end, I'm going to end up with a green panel. I do add some blending solution to the felt pad because it just kind of helps mix the colors a bit. And after I've added my ink all over this panel, I found that adding a little bit of blending solution to the felt pad and just going over the embossing with it helped clean any alcohol ink that was sitting on top of the embossing. So you can see you can do embossed resist with any type of medium as long as you have something porous that's going to soak up your ink and something slick that's going to resist it. So in this case, the embossing powder. So this is what our final panel looks like. And before we go ahead to assemble it into a card, let's just touch on the last technique, which is foiled ink resist. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I've really been playing with it lately. I've got some more toner sheets here. This one is the Simple Sayings gift tag set. So these are a bunch of tags, and I thought they would work perfectly to work as sentiments on cards as well. So I'm just going to cut a few of these out and get them ready and foil them. I've also got the other toner sheet set that we used earlier, the vintage greeting set. And you can see that I've got all of these smaller sentiments here. I'm just going to cut them out. As I mentioned, there are coordinating dies you could use with these. I don't have them, so I'm just cutting them out into straight banners here. And I'm going to grab all of these and foil them with the Moonlit Lake Maker Forte foil that I have here. So I did actually do a mix of foiling. I did some in the Moonlit Lake, which is absolutely gorgeous. It's very shiny. It's beautiful, all the things. And then I also did some of them in the Mer-mazing foil that we used earlier. So you can see these foiled so nicely. I've just revealed this one here, which is a nice tag with that cute little deer or bear. I'm not 100% sure. Now you can see again, I've got some overfoiling in that frame on the tag, and I'm just rubbing it with my finger. And this just rubs off the excess foil that isn't supposed to be foiled and makes your foiled image just that much more clean. So you can see that foiled beautifully. There's also another one here, which are these group of 3 trees, which foil beautifully. Now it really sucks that on camera, it is hard to capture the shine and the beauty of these tags and these sentiments, but I guarantee you in real life, they are stunning. So now I'm just going to go ahead and cut these down and just get them to the right size so that I can place them on my card. I like to cut them ahead of time before I do the ink resist because when I do the ink resist, it tends to darken the edges and I like that look. It's completely up to you if you want to add your ink and then cut it afterwards. So now that I've got that nicely cut, let's go ahead and get to the foiled ink resist technique now. So for this, again, I'm grabbing my Distress inks. It's a dye ink, so that's all you really need for this. And I'm using some candied apple, and I'm going to use some aged mahogany just to add red to this foiled banner. And you can see this works just like other resist techniques. The foil is slick and the paper is porous. So my ink is going to absorb into the paper and resist the foil. So you can see this works with anything. All you have to do is think about what's slick and what's porous, and you can probably do it. Now, when I initially tried out this technique, I was afraid that my foil might come off while I'm rubbing it with the ink tool, but it actually doesn't go anywhere. So don't be afraid to add a little bit of pressure. Do be a bit gentle. You don't want to scratch anything, but I guarantee you your foil is not going anywhere and you can add as much ink as you want. And the most important thing here is at the end, just buff off the foiled areas so that the ink that's sitting on top moves away and your image just really pops after that. Now for this tag, I decided to use Oxide inks just to show you the difference between a dye ink and a pigment ink, or at least an ink with a pigment component. You can see that the pigment component of the ink is sitting on top of the foil and you can really see it. It's really chalky here. And that's completely okay. All that means is you just need to buff your foil just that little bit more than you would have to do with the dye ink. And it does come off and looks absolutely stunning for a different look. Now let's go ahead and ink up this last tag here. This is the 3 trees. I'm using some pine needles and some mowed lawn. And I'm just going to have the 2 colors coming from either side of the tag and meeting in the center of the trees. And you can see you could do ink blending with different colors on your foiled images as well, just like we did with the other panels. Now for this foiled Warm Wishes sentiment strip, I cut it down a little and now I'm just adding some red ink, some candied apple ink straight from the ink pad to the paper, and it took it up nicely and the foil resisted the ink as it should. Now let's put together the Gingko panel that we use the alcohol ink resist technique on, and all I'm doing is attaching it to an A2 sized white card base, and I'm just going to attach that Merry Christmas banner that we did the foil ink resist technique on with some foam squares, and that's pretty much it for that card. So now I'm moving on to the two gift tags. For this one, I'm just going to add some white and blue string or twine or whatever you want to call it, just looping it through the hole. You can see I punched it with a one hole punch here, and I'm just going to thread that through, and that's just a simple tag, nice and easily done. Foil, foil ink resist, and add your string, and you're good to go. Now for this little tree tag, I'm actually going to add that Warm Wishes sentiment banner that we added the red ink to, and I'm adding that with a few small foam squares. And then once that's on there nicely, I'll go ahead and cut the hole with the one hole punch and add some red and white string to this one. So you can see that these resist techniques work perfectly for cards, gift tags, any of your projects. They all look super stunning, and it's a great way to extend the use of your inks, your embossing powder, your foil, all of your different mediums, and help them work together and create the best looking cards you can make. Here's a little picture of that final Gingko card. Now, it's as I told you, the foil is really hard to capture the beauty of it. So I'm so sorry that I couldn't really capture that in such a great way that you could see how it looks in real life, but I guarantee you it looks great. Just give it a try yourself and you'll see exactly what I mean. So those are my cards for today. I really hope that you've learned something new and the resist techniques that I've shown you today. Maybe you've had a bit of a refresher on some of the other techniques, and I hope that you've had a great time with me in this video. It's been such an honor to create with you guys for Inktoberfest this year, and I hope that you all have a great day, and don't forget to stay tuned for the rest of the inky days of Inktoberfest.